Hey, it's Citizen Cosmos. We're Serge and Anna, and we discover Cosmos by chatting with awesome people from various teams within the Cosmos ecosystem and the community. Join us if you're curious how dreams and ambitions become code.
Basically, the way to think about what I do is I am the engineering manager at the top of the engineering organization.
Would you say that basically that means you're trying to find the cocktail which gives you the best drunken state without the hangover?
Tendermint core as a system, I think it's one of the most elegant solutions to distributed consensus. I would not be working on it if I didn't think it was amazing. There is one thing that gives me a little bit of pause about it, which is that your voting power is correlated to how much of the token you have decided to stake, which is correlated to how much of the token you own. So it encodes this bias towards people who are already participating in the system.
Hey everyone, welcome to a new episode of Citizen Cosmos. And today we are joined by Tess Rinearson, who is the VP at Interchain GMBH. Oh my God, I really got all of that confused. So Tess, you gotta help me. Did I say that all correctly?
Yeah, I would say so. I'm not German, so I think it's GmbH, but ask a German if you want to make sure you get the pronunciation correct.
Welcome anyways. We're really glad to finally have you on. We have been trying to chase you for a little bit, but we finally found you.
I'm so excited to be chatting with you. What a fun way to kick off the year.
How is it in 2021? Is it better than 2020?
Well, we had some snow, so that was kind of exciting. Actually, my first Berlin snow day. I'm looking forward to the summer, I would say.
Awesome. We actually were in Berlin last year. We spent some of the winter in Berlin. We went to the Chaos Communication Congress, and then we spent a few months in the spring and the summer. And yes, the summer is much better in Berlin than the winter time. But it's amazing. Anyways, usually we start with talking about the role of the guest. But if you don't mind, we're going to start a little bit differently with your professional preferences. And we found some info about your engineering background on Medium, your manager's work at Chain. You're obviously a researcher. You write a lot of amazing articles. You tweet a lot of really cool stuff. So who's Tess and what does she do?
Yeah, totally. What a fun and honestly open-ended question. But yeah, I started my career basically as an engineer at Medium. So I actually dropped out of college to join Medium when it was quite small. And that was just honestly an amazing place to begin my career. Learned so much from the team there. But after I'd been there for about 2 years, I started feeling like I just wanted to get deeper on databases and systems because I just started to feel drawn towards those things. And so at that point, it was early 2015. And I was kind of looking around. And I don't know how long the two of you have been in the blockchain space, but you might remember that was kind of the beginning of the blockchain, not Bitcoin era. It was kind of the blockchain, whatever that was emerging as this kind of novel distributed database. And so I was really drawn to that idea. I ended up joining a company called Chain, which was very, very small at the time. I think it was 8 people. I stayed with that team for several years, actually. But in my time there, we worked on lots of different things. So when I joined Chain, it was actually a Bitcoin API, developer tools on top of Bitcoin itself. But the company explored a pretty wide variety of different blockchain products. So after the Bitcoin API, then we did this thing with this protocol called Open Assets, which was let you move third-party assets on top of the Bitcoin blockchain using the metadata fields in transactions. Then we wrote our own blockchain protocol and sort of did this enterprise blockchain thing for a while. Even did a cloud-hosted kind of ledger, distributed ledger solution for people. None of those things panned out ultimately, although it was an amazing learning experience. And the team there was just full of so many brilliant, wonderful people. But that team basically got acqui-hired into the Stellar ecosystem. So we went and we joined this company called Interstellar, which is the for-profit side of the Stellar ecosystem. So sort of this in the same way that on the Cosmos ecosystem, we have a lot of different entities doing different things, kind of similar things happening in the Stellar ecosystem. And so I did that for a little while. I worked as the VP of engineering for that company and did a whole lot of different things sort of in that role. But one of the things that I did was work with the research team there. So I would not say that I myself am a researcher, but I did have the joy and the pleasure of working with a team of really amazing researchers who were doing very, very cool things with zero-knowledge proofs and integrating that into the Stellar ecosystem. After I decided to leave Interstellar, I actually really wanted to move to Berlin. That was a huge thing for me too. I kind of always wanted to live in Berlin since I visited the first time when I was a teenager and I just knew that I wanted to live here someday. And I had been following the Tendermint project for a while, specifically Tendermint Core, the consensus engine. Because when I had been at Chain, and like I said, we had our own blockchain that was like for enterprise teams for a while. One of the things that we were looking into and trying to make a choice about was what kind of consensus model we wanted to use. And that actually was kind of like the beginning of my interest in kind of the soft spot that I developed and that I just carried with me for consensus algorithms and for distributed consensus. And one of the papers I read when I was getting into that was a very, very early version of the Tendermint white paper, again, specifically about the consensus piece, because that was something that we were looking into and thinking about using for Chain. And ultimately, we decided not to use it for two reasons. One was that it was overkill for the use case we were looking at, because we were really looking at these closed networks or like semi-closed networks that didn't really need the kind of heavyweight Byzantine fault tolerance that something like Tendermint Core provides. The other was that the paper wasn't totally finished and it had to-dos all over it. Because this is in, I think, maybe the very beginning of 2016 or late 2015. And so it had to-dos all over it. And I was just like, this project is not ready. But I kept my eye on it. And, over the years, I just kind of watched it evolve. And I always thought it was very cool. So late 2019, I learned that they were looking for someone to come in and lead the Tendermint Core project from an engineering management perspective. And that team was working out of Berlin. And it was just this perfect match, stars aligned. So I came over and joined the project in late 2019. And then in early 2020, some of the core engineering teams spun out of Tendermint Inc. into this new core development, open source oriented company called Interchain GmbH. And so that's where I've been since the beginning of last year.
That's a really luck for all the stars to get aligned and you ended up in Berlin. And wow, that's cool when dreams come true, isn't it? I was just going to say about your background. I know that obviously the listeners, they can't see that, but in the background, you have a really Berlinish, to me. It's a wheel of a bicycle. And for me, for some reason, I associate Berlin with bicycles on the wall. I don't know why, but I love Berlin. It's my favorite city in the world. And I've traveled the whole world. And when I see it's you're obviously in Berlin.
That's so funny. Yeah, we have all of our bikes. We have 2 people living in this apartment and 3 bikes, of course. And they're all on the walls. And it is funny because I think one of my favorite things about Berlin is the cycling culture and the fact that it's just so normal and everyday. And I think if I were to move back to the US at some point, I think that might be one of the things that would be hardest for me to adjust to, because I'm just so attached to going out and just riding my bike as my transport. In the US, when you get on your bike, you have to put on your armor, you're going into battle. You put on your helmet, you put on your high-vis vest, you put on all your lights, and then, have to give the finger to anyone who tries to run you off the road. Okay, not that I do that myself. I'm very polite. But no, it's just a totally different attitude towards cyclists and public space.
You just think about it. You don't actually show them.
Yeah. I'm one of those people who I don't do confrontation very well. I just freeze up. So that I'm not giving anyone the finger, but maybe I'm wishing I did after.
That's awesome. You mentioned Stella and Berlin and Interchain Stella and Bulletproofs. I met a few years ago a guy called Oleg Ganza, and I think maybe you're familiar, right? Because obviously Berlin, Stellar.
Yeah.
I thought so, yeah. Cool guy.
Oleg and I joined Chain around the same time in 2015. So he and I worked together on all of this stuff. He was the main architect for the Chain protocol that I described. And then he and I also worked very closely together on the project that is now called Slingshot, which is Stellar's zero-knowledge proof on Stellar solution.
Him and Adam Buck were the first people after my 7 or 8 years in being in blockchain who managed to explain cryptography in normal sense to me. It's okay, now that makes sense, right? It took me 8 years to meet you two guys, and then suddenly I get it. He's a great guy, but let's keep it with you and not about Oleg. You said that you attracted to the consensus, and that's what kind of caught your eye at first when you saw the paper and so on and so forth. But our personal bet was that you're attracted to cryptography more. So this was our guess. Were we correct? That's the first question or not?
I would say that I'm a little bit more on the distributed systems side of things. But I think cryptography is really cool, and it's actually something that I've been interested in casual way for a really long time. Even when I was in high school, I took a math class that was set up such that the students was for your last year of school, and you could kind of study whatever you wanted in part of that. And the subject that I picked for my little 2-week final project was around cryptography. So it's something that I've been interested in way before blockchain stuff in kind of a casual way. But I think my background as an engineer and as a computer science student, before I quit college, I was studying computer science. But I think like that background, again, the sort of more like distributed systems piece of it, the thing that resonates with me most deeply. But I do really appreciate and admire the cryptography piece. But it also like sometimes for me is kind of black magic. A lot of the bulletproof stuff that I was working on with Oleg and others, people would start talking about it. Or even one of the other amazing cryptographers I worked with on that team was a woman named Kathy Yoon. And she was also amazing at explaining this stuff. She could give talks to, people who are technical but not cryptographers and explain it all the way through. And it was one of those things where at each step I'd be like, I understand how you got from A to B, but when I see A to Z, it still blows my mind every time. I can follow each step, but somehow the end result is still just like fantastic and magic. And I can watch you do it, but there's like, I can't do that myself. I'm not going to be cooking this stuff. So that was also a cool experience, like as a manager, because I could really support that team and help them out. And they were also just doing things that I was completely incapable of doing on my own.
It's hashed, it's working. I mean, what else do you want? It's here. There we go. Yeah, the hashes are working. I know exactly what you're talking about.
I think, to be totally honest, like the part of distributed systems that I truly am most excited about is the consensus algorithms piece, right? This question of how do you get a bunch of computers to agree on, in the smallest form of the problem, it's like one value, but in this space of blockchains, you kind of extrapolate that to a series of values, and those series of values are the blocks in the blockchain. But how do you get all these computers to come to agreement on something when you have all of these constraints? And the constraints are like, there's no central single point of truth. Obviously, that's like a really, really key part of these decentralized systems. You might have some number of actors who are malicious. You have an open network, so anyone can join. I think in some ways, it's interesting because the other thing that I do that really is the bulk of my work is really in management and getting teams to work efficiently and getting people to work efficiently together. And I think there actually are parallels there, right? Because you're trying to get a group of people to come to an agreement on what they're going to do next. And I guess as the manager, maybe technically I do have the authority to say like, this is what we're going to do. But that's just not my style, right? My style is very much like I want to work with the whole group of people to figure out what we want to do together. And the interesting thing with people is that you know who everyone is. Maybe your membership set is a little, like can fluctuate a little bit, but for the most part, it's pretty fixed. There is like some trust between all the people. And at the end of the day, you can just take a vote. And one of the ways that I think about distributed consensus with computers is that it's the same thing. You're trying to figure out how to take a vote. But the problem is when you have these, again, membership sets, like the computers can come and go basically at will, or if you're trying to attack it, you potentially spin up a bunch of new computers to be new voters. You can't just take a majority vote. You have to be more thoughtful about how you're going to construct your voting sets. And so different consensus algorithms have different philosophies around how you want to construct this idea. A voting set, or the word that is usually is quorum. So you want to figure out how to come to a quorum. That idea for consensus algorithms of things like coming to quorums or making these votes, that idea is actually from traditional computer science. It's not really a blockchain specific thing. The thing that is a little bit more blockchain specific, and you'll see this, just to talk about like Tendermint Core, Tendermint Core is a proof of stake consensus algorithm. So that means basically that we leverage stake or like security deposits that have to put up. We use those to construct the voting set. So you have to like put up a certain amount of collateral before you can be included in the voting set. And then if you misbehave, you can be kicked out of the voting set and we take a bunch of your collateral. And so we use this token as like an additional layer on top of this voting mechanism in order to make sure that it can actually function safe and effectively.
How far away are we, in your opinion, from the point where computations becomes provable and verifiable in a distributed manner? We can say, okay, that's it. We have a lot of consensus algorithms, proof of work, proof of authority, proof of stake, whatever. I'll tell you where it's coming from. We spoke with Žarko. He's amazing, right? He's just such a huge mind where you can get into it. And we were talking. He's, I guess, more of a researcher, and you come in, again, you are a researcher as well, but like you said, you're coming from a slightly different background. So in your opinion, when will we reach that point where we can say all the computation in the world is done in a provable, verifiable, and a distributed manner? Will we ever reach it?
That is actually not really a problem that I myself am thinking about so much. And it's interesting that you mentioned Zarko because he and I work pretty closely together, actually. We don't work for the same company, but we collaborate. And I think that's a great example of kind of the kinds of collaboration that happen in the Cosmos ecosystem. There's a really interesting dynamic between Zarko's team, which I really think of as the research team, and my team, which is more of like the implementation team, where when it comes time to actually like make changes to the Tendermint core spec or things like that, it really is this like joint effort where they bring their very academic, there's a lot of academics on Zarko's team, and they really have a lot of experience writing formal specifications and things like that. And then my team brings to the table this kind of we're engineers. So it's this really cool collaboration where each team brings something a little bit different to the table, but together we produce something I think that's quite amazing. Yeah, I would say I'm not, and my team is not really thinking about generally verifiable distributed computation, although I think that is also a very interesting problem.
It's funny that you just mentioned the Zarko and your collaboration, because literally 10 minutes before the podcast, me and Anna made a small guess as to yours and Zarko connection, and we were absolutely spot on that he does the research and Tess does the implementation. But it's still interesting because, we can see a lot of parallels. I know it's crazy talk, but it's like parallels with, for example, having a recipe for a dish and actually cooking a dish. Somebody might make you this recipe for a perfect cocktail from the Bahamas, but if I'm in Russia, there's no way I'll find those ingredients and be able to make that cocktail. And that's the same thing with computations. You can make the research and say, here's the research, here's formal verifications, assurance audits, whatever. And then here's the guys who are implementing and saying, well, sorry.
Yeah, in that analogy, I would say maybe it's a little bit reductive to say like they do all the research, they write all the specs, because they have also implemented parts of Tendermint core. They're also maybe not Zarko's research team exactly, but Zarko's research team is within Informal Systems, which is a company based in Toronto, and they have a team of engineers working on the Rust implementation also. So there's lots of different moving pieces, and we all, again, work together. But to go back to your recipe and cooking metaphor, which I love, I think you could say that generally these research teams have written a lot of recipes, and the implementation teams have cooked a lot of things. And so we come together to try to jointly write the recipe and then cook the cake. No, you don't cook cakes. You bake cakes.
No,
but you know what I'm saying.
It's a great correction that you made, because I missed out on what you said there, and you guys make the recipe together. They don't just let you cook. That's a great correction.
Right, yeah. And we go back and forth. And, I think sometimes there are aspects of the protocol, especially the consensus, how exactly are votes structured, what information do you pass in a vote, how do you identify misbehavior, what kinds of evidence do you need to pass around the network as proof of misbehavior. That stuff can be really, really finicky. That's the kind of stuff where the research team really can be very hands-on in writing and updating the spec. And a lot of that stuff, they also are really formally verifying it using this formal verification tool and system. If you've spoken to Zarko, he probably talked about this a bit as well. But for anyone who is not familiar with these kinds of things, basically the idea is that you can write something which is also called a spec, but it's not an English language spec, but it's like a programmatic specification of what the system is supposed to do. And then you can put that through another program that verifies that this spec does what it's supposed to do. So it's kind of like testing for your concept rather than for your implementation. So you can make sure that your algorithm conceptually is correct. And then when it comes time to actually test and verify the implementation, we have lots of other tools for that too. Actually, one of the things that is cool about Tendermint core that we haven't really talked about that much, and my team has sort of been saying, maybe we should write about this, maybe we should talk about this some more, is that there are so many levels of testing and verification that we are working on, like all the way through the life cycle of this project. So I just talked about formal verification on the spec. That happens at, I would say, like the most conceptual level. It's not really tied to the implementation. But we have all of these other kinds of testing that we do, including on the implementation. So one tool that we use that kind of tests the implementation, or like the way that the implementation tests the concepts, is a system called model-based testing, which leverages those formal models that are used for the formal verification. And we can actually use those models that kind of come out of the formal verification process to generate test cases. So just input and output test cases, data. And then we can write unit tests or integration tests on the implementation that check that it conforms to these inputs and outputs that came out of the formal model. So that's another way that we tie it together. We use another tool called Jepsen, which tests that Tendermint conforms to the consistency models that it says it conforms to. So there's all these different models for distributed systems in terms of how they serialize transactions on them. This is going to get really into the weeds if I don't stop now.
That's great. Go on. That's great. We love it.
But basically, it checks that Tendermint makes certain guarantees around how blocks are ordered relative to each other, right, across the whole system. And Jepsen helps test that those blocks actually happen in the order that they say they do by spinning up these simulations that sometimes you can inject faults and things like that. So you can start a simulation and then tell the simulation to crash in a certain way. It's called a split brain scenario, where half the network goes off and tries to do one thing and half the network tries to do another thing. And when they come back together, does the overall network conform to the consistency model that Tendermint is supposed to? So that's Jepsen. And then, of course, we have kind of the normal unit tests, integration tests, end-to-end tests specifically, where we spin up all these different kinds of test nets that are in different configurations, using different databases, all kinds of things like that, and just put it through its paces, see what happens. So we really are testing this stuff all the time in all of these ways and along all these different axes. So we're thinking about the correctness of the specification, all the way down to, does a function that verifies a hash function, does that behave the way it's supposed to? It can be very specific. So yeah, that's something we actually don't talk about very often, but I think is a very cool thing we do.
If I was to narrow this down for the non-technical guys who will listen to this, could you say that, back to the analogy of the recipe, would you say that basically that means you're trying to find the cocktail which gives you the best drunken state, gets you drunk really quickly, really cheap, and doesn't give you a hangover?
Oh my gosh, I'm not sure how to extend this metaphor to test this.
No, this was just, you don't have to.
No, let me try. I have one approach. Maybe it's you want to say, we want to make sure that the cocktail is tasty, it uses the ingredients it says it's going to use, maybe it gets you drunk appropriately. It doesn't kill you, all these kinds of things. But yeah, you kind of want to test these different attributes of the whole system, ranging all the way from the very beginning to the final implementation and really those fine implementation details.
Why are you guys a separate entity? I know the story, the public story, right? But I want to hear it from you, and I'm sure other people know it as well, but let's hear it from you. Why did you guys decide to make a separate entity?
This is one of those stories and things where every person kind of has their own perspective on it. It's many dimensional, and each person kind of has their own dimension to it. The way that I see it really is many projects were all housed within Tendermint Inc. And around the time that I joined even, there was a lot of discussion within Tendermint Inc. about the future of the company and which way it wanted to go. And the prevailing, by the end, it's so hard, I get confused by what year it is. At the beginning of 2020, so a year ago, it became clear, or it seemed clear, that Tendermint Inc. was really focused on this project called Virgo, which has since ended up playing less of a significant role. But at the time, that really looked like the future of the company. And that wasn't necessarily super compatible with also doing this core open source engineering. Honestly, the Virgo project was not super closely specified. I think a lot of people had different ideas of what it was going to be or what it should be. Honestly, there were some power struggles about this. And it was just a very distracting environment for core engineering work, which is honestly, I love it. It is my bread and butter, but it should be boring. And we wanted to create an equally boring company where this stuff could just happen with complete focus and without sort of the distractions of uncertainty about a product future or questions about where leadership wanted to take things. We wanted to just really scope the focus of the team to maintaining these open source projects and shipping IBC, doing all these things that we knew were really necessary from an infrastructure perspective for the whole ecosystem. But these things were not necessarily the cool, flashy end user products, which we are very excited for and we want to support them, but we don't necessarily want to get pulled into all of that or kind of be too dependent on those things. We wanted to be independent enough that we could make the right decisions for these infrastructure projects as independent projects and not necessarily just to support a specific end user project or something like that. That's my angle on it. I think if you talk to different people, they may tell you slightly different things. But yeah, that was that. I mean, and the cool thing is that we still work super, super closely with Tendermint Inc. They help us out a lot when it comes to any kind of like marketing thing, for example. We literally are a team of engineers. If you go to interchain.berlin, it looks like the website of like a computer science professor who like doesn't know how to write CSS because it was written by a bunch of engineers who like don't know how to write CSS. Including me, let's be clear. Like I mostly made the website. We don't know what we're doing with marketing or things like that. So it's really amazing to be able to continue to collaborate with Tendermint Inc. because they are so good at that stuff. But we can really, for the most part, focus on writing code and designing architecture and things like that. I think it's been a really good symbiotic relationship.
One question is bound to arise in that field. You said that you mostly focus on engineering part, and on thinking about end user. So how do you choose your path? What you're going to do next and what is going to be correct? Because for projects which communicate with end users, it's a little bit more easy because you can go to users and ask them directly. But in your case, you don't have this channel yet to ask user what you think about engineering.
I would say we do have users. I just would differentiate them from end users, which are more like consumers or people who are using like applications built on Cosmos or built on other Tendermint-based blockchains. So we do talk to our users, but our users are like the Cosmos SDK or like other blockchain frameworks often are our users, which actually is like kind of amazing because it means that we can, like we all speak the same language, right? Like talk like blockchain people to each other. So it actually is really easy and amazing in a lot of ways. One thing that we are aware of that we're actually working on fixing right now is that we have basically like a few projects that we're in pretty close touch with. We have shared Slack channels or we're all in Discord together. So we hear a lot from a few projects, but we know that there's other projects that aren't as chatty with us. And so one of the things that we want to do this year is more proactive outreach to those people who are maybe not as active in our own channels. So one of the things that like we're working on right now is putting together a survey to send to our users, which is a really simple start, but it's just something that like we hadn't been doing. And I would say that kind of thing is also a downside of having a team that is like mostly engineers. So Interchain GmbH as a company right now, it's like 12 engineers and then 3 people who are working in operations, DevRel, grants, all these things. Like they're doing a ton of stuff. It's kind of like the ratio there. And if you look at most other companies in the space, like that is a very, very heavy on the engineering. That leads to a lot of things that are really lovely for us in a lot of ways. We have a very meeting light culture, for example, because most people want to spend their time writing code. We do have meetings, but we make them very effective. We're very efficient about it. But anyway, this is all a way of saying that sometimes there are aspects of like community outreach or user outreach that has fallen by the wayside a little bit, but we are aware of that stuff. And it is definitely something where we have like some targeted goals for 2021 about reaching out to users and hearing more from them.
Do you end up doing more management or more research on yourself personally?
I do a mix of line management for the Tendermint core team, which is to say like I manage engineers directly. And then I also help out with the other engineering teams at Interchain GmbH. So for example, one of my teammates who reports to me is our new Cosmos Hub Gaia lead, who's building out a team to be very focused on Gaia. So I would say it's pretty management. My role right now is pretty management oriented.
By the way, what is the difference between a VPE and a CTO?
That's a great question. And that's like one of those things that I think is like a hotly debated question sometimes. What I would say, and the reason that I have the title VPE, is that VPEs are the people who make sure that the engineering organization is doing everything they should be doing. Shipping code on time, shipping high quality code, hiring the right people, retaining people. I don't want to say like just day-to-day operations, but kind of making sure that stuff is happening in the way that it is supposed to be happening. That's the VPE's role. CTOs, I think that's actually a much more flexible title and can mean a lot of different things. I have known CTOs and worked for CTOs where they didn't really have any reports. Their job was to try to do speculative research on what technical direction the company should be going next. I've also known CTOs where their roles, really, they were like head of sales in a lot of ways. They have a technical background and they know the tech inside and out, but mostly what they do is like go to partner meetings and kind of present this like public facing side of the company, public technical face. And the things that I'm really passionate about, honestly, very internal and cultivating good relationships within the engineering team, making sure that people are happy and well supported and getting the kinds of like professional development that they want to see in themselves. That is stuff that I get really, really excited about and I'm very passionate about. And so that's why I have the VPE position rather than a CTO position.
If you go on the 2017 ICO website, everybody was a CTO. Everybody was, what's your profession? I'm a CTO. I'm a CEO. I'm a C. So, oh my God, it was funny. It was funny back then. But thanks for explaining it, because I was always contemplating that, and I saw a lot of battles on the internet. People say, no, it's a CTO. No, it's a VPE. It's interesting to hear a point of view of somebody who actually does the differences.
I think basically there are a lot of names that I could have for my current role. Like I could be head of engineering, or I could be like director of engineering. But basically the way to think about what I do is I am the engineering manager at the top of the engineering organization for Interchain GmbH. Again, pretty small engineering organization, so it's pretty flat. Like there's only 1 or 2 levels below me. Again, below with quotes. But yeah, that's the way to think about it. My job is to make sure that we keep sailing the ship in the right direction. Yeah, I would say that the way that I make that happen is a mix of spending a lot of time talking to people one-on-one and making sure that they're not blocked by anything. They know what they're doing. I do some code review. I do a lot of architecture review, actually, where I read we have a very writing-heavy culture where we spend a lot of time writing design documents and RFCs for the spec and things like that. So I spend a lot of time reading those things. And then to some extent, I do a little bit of public interfacing for the team. I write blog posts, I give talks, things like that. But I really view my role as like shielding the team in a lot of ways from things that would be a distraction. So I want to make sure that people can do their jobs, and I'll try to take care of everything else.
I have the hard question of the talk, I guess, but I'm not sure. It depends how you're going to answer that. As the VP of the company, okay, let's call it a company that works on the engine that makes it all work together, what's your personal view on the evolution of the Tendermint consensus engine? Where is it going to go in the next 1 to 5, 25 years? I always hated that question in interviews. Where you want to be in 25 years? Definitely not here. I don't know, whatever. Like, answer it the way you want to answer it.
Yeah. So what I would say is I do not know where it's going to be in 25 years. There's like a radical approach to distributed consensus that like we haven't come up yet that everyone adopts sometime in 25 years. But I think what we have right now is pretty good. And what I would say what we're really focused on this year is building a really solid foundation for future experiments. So one of the funny things about Tendermint Core is that it, as a project, it's like 7 years old. It supports $1 billion. It's very much a real thing with very serious implications. And it has not reached a 1.0 release yet. So what this means for anyone who's maybe isn't super up to date with the nuances of software versioning, what it means to not be 1.0 yet is that we haven't made any guarantees about what might change in the future. That can be like a pretty difficult thing for users who are maybe trying to build on top of things. If we release a new version and we completely changed our APIs, we've really pulled the rug out from under our users. And we actually just kind of did that with the last release. So we just released Tendermint 034, which is the release for this upcoming Stargate upgrade. And one of the things that 034 did was completely replace the encoding serialization library that we use. What this meant for users was that the data we were sending across the wire was completely different format, so completely incompatible. I think this change was a really good change to make. It was very important. It really, really improved performance. The users who have switched to this new version have sometimes said that like their throughput is like 60% higher. So it's really has made huge differences for people. And the old library was just like harder to use and not as well maintained and other things like that. So this has been a really good change overall. But it was a difficult change to adjust to at the same time, or like making that adjustment was sometimes painful. What we're really focusing on for this year is solidifying all of that kinds of stuff. So all of our interfaces, our APIs, we're really trying to hammer it down and finalize it. That sounds a little bit boring, but when you have a really long list of small improvements that you know you want to make, or sometimes big improvements that you know you want to make, that might impact those interfaces, you have to get all of those and then solidify the interfaces. And so that's really what we're focused on doing, is getting all of the improvements in, all of the stuff that we know needs to go into this sort of stabilized form of Tendermint, putting it through its paces, using all of those testing techniques I described. So we're really investing more aggressively in those things as well, because we're just really trying to get to this point where Tendermint is like super stable, performant, easy to use. So that's the goal for the year, which again, maybe doesn't sound super radical, but I think will be a big improvement for our users. Once we have that solid foundation, I think then we're going to be able to take a step back and say, okay, are there any more radical changes that we might want to build on top of this product? we'll have Tendermint 1.0 at that point, which will be like long-lived and stable. Do we want to kind of tie a bow on this and then take some of the things that we're most excited about from Tendermint 1.0 and create a Tendermint 2.0 that does have some radically different changes in some ways? I'm being pretty speculative when I talk about stuff like that, but the TLDR is that we're really focused on getting to this very stable, performant place. And we do want to use that as a foundation then to do future explorations and do more research and that kind of thing.
Before we go on, I just want to make a small comment about serialization. I don't know if you're familiar with Orbit. I love what they're doing with the serialization. So basically, the Orbit or operational system, the number is going down and their strive is to get to 0. 0 will be the release, which will not need any more like releases after it. So basically now they started from, let's say, 1, and then it's 0.9, 0.8, 0.7. It's going down. So they took it like,
wow.
Yeah, they took it a different way. Have a look. It's actually really cool. I know it's nothing to do with Tendermint.
I think that maybe speaks to a little bit of a philosophical difference also. I really feel like software is not ever done. You can put things into maintenance mode, but there's always things to do. And so I don't think I would ever, I'll just say maybe that's like one of several things I might disagree with the Urbit team on.
Now, there's more behind it, but just the whole philosophical idea of going down. But I see what you're saying.
You know that I feel that it's not so philosophical issue because it's very ambitious aim to stabilize the core. I know that everyone who works with API or try to take care of any node knows how difficult it could be, and it could be a nightmare. If, let's say, the documentation or you have a big legacy in the code, you sometimes have a long nights without sleep, try to figure out what's really going on here.
Yeah, we don't want our users to ever have that experience. And I would say I want to minimize that experience for my team.
We would love to discuss your story about Medium social graph. Could you explain to us in a couple of words what it's all about?
Oh my gosh. So that was a long time ago. And I know it's changed, actually. So I know they've changed the way that they handle this. But that is a cool project for me to talk about because that was one of the projects that helped me realize I was excited about systems and databases. But basically, one of the projects that I worked on when I was an engineer at Medium was the service, like the web service, that managed Medium's social graph. It was cool because it used this graph database, which let you, instead of modeling data in rows and tables in the way that a SQL database would, or relational database would, it let you model data through relationships between objects, and those objects could be like directional, and the relationships could be like labeled in different ways. So you actually can really build this graph, like graph in the computer science sense of the word, where you had people and all of their followers. And so that was provided the foundation for Medium's first like social recommendation features. So most of the time that I was at Medium, actually, I worked on the recommendation team in general, like the reader experience was kind of my home when I was there. But for a while, there weren't really like social features. Like the concept of following was something that didn't exist at first. And so this social graph integrated in not just the idea that you could like follow people, but also that you could follow publications and things like that. So that kind of set up this system where it would then like recommend posts to you based on who you were following and what you were following.
So it's kind of mastermind that graph a little bit.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the funny thing was that it worked really well, except for we had one user who had a ton of followers. And this is like not an uncommon problem in social networks, right? There's like sometimes one user. The problem in this case is that our one user who had a ton of followers was Ev Williams, the founder and the CEO, who also had been a founder of Twitter, which is partly why he had so many followers, because we were like also importing people's Twitter followers. So he had a ton of followers. He had like 1 million or so followers, and like everyone else had like a few thousand. Normally, when you have one user who's an outlier, it's not a problem because your boss isn't going to see it. But when that user is the boss, then you have a problem. So I actually don't remember exactly how we solved that problem or how we got around it. I do remember that pretty vividly. We were like, this works great, except for this one edge case.
Oh.
And the edge case is the boss.
Do you think that such things as the knowledge graph, for example, with Medium are interventions into social communications, or it's just the way it is and it helps people to communicate?
What do you mean when you say interventions?
Well, I'll give you an example that happened to me that I saw recently. I don't know if you're heard of the Chaos Communication Congress, the CCC, which is the biggest hacker congress, the oldest one that happens in Germany. And last year, 2020, obviously did it online. And they did this whole 2D world, and you could pick the talks you wanted to listen to. And as you picked the talks you wanted to listen to, it gave you suggestions, because CCC is this huge thing. And there was this one person who gave a really interesting talk about the views on the work of the life of sex workers in Germany. And he got really upset. And the first thing he got upset about, because he came onto the stage and he said that the system that suggested things to people who picked his talk was to do with drugs, weapons, and so on and so forth. And I'm sure that it wasn't done on purpose. That's what they said. But they said, well, I kind of get upset about it because that's intervention into what people are trying. I mean, do you see what I'm getting at? And again, this is devil's advocate question.
Yeah, totally. I'm still a little bit not sure exactly what you mean when you say intervention, but I do think that when you build computer systems, they often mirror things that are happening in the real world. So I mentioned I work on a consensus algorithm from a technical side of things, but I also spend a lot of time building consensus among people. And it's funny because they kind of mirror each other in a lot of ways. I think kind of in the same way, often you can end up with computer systems that encode biases or relationships that also exist or are perceived to exist in the real world. And I think one of the roles of people who are working on technology is to be really deliberate about what biases and hierarchies and relationships and power structures we encode in our systems, because whatever we choose to replicate, we're helping enforce. And so, to be honest, one of the things that I love Tendermint Core as a system, I think it's one of the most elegant solutions to distributed consensus. I would not be working on it if I didn't think it was amazing. There is one thing that gives me a little bit of pause about it, which is that your voting power is correlated to like how much of the token you have decided to stake, which is correlated to how much of the token you own. So it encodes this bias towards people who are already participating in the system or who maybe already have a lot of money. That's like not amazing, right? That is the downside to this. And so I don't have an amazing solution to that. And I don't necessarily have a solution to how do you build a social graph in a way that doesn't replicate pre-existing power structures that maybe we don't want to replicate. Especially since I'm not really thinking about that stuff anymore. I don't really have answers to that. But I do think that it is a very real relationship. And my ask of other builders would be to just be aware of it, because I think having that awareness is the first step.
One last question into that part, because I really want to hear your opinion. Do you think that decentralized knowledge graphs are the holy grail to solve those things? Knowledge graphs which will not be a black box intermediary opinion of somebody, but will be the opinion of many. Is that kind of the holy grail here?
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, but again, there's caveats and gotchas. If you encode majority opinions always, that can be, by default, oppressive to minority opinions. And sometimes there are opinions that are knowledge or beliefs that is harmful, right? And you don't necessarily want to spread that. You don't necessarily want to like suppress it either. It's really, really thorny stuff all the way around. I would say I've had some conversations with people lately, and I've heard some discussion around using decentralized moderation strategies, because obviously free speech on the internet, and I don't even know if free speech is the right word, because I know that's such a government thing, but you know, a lot of people who are kind of in the decentralization space are concerned that centralized authorities, even if those authorities are companies like Twitter or Facebook, can censor their speech on their platforms. I don't know if that's technically free speech or not, but that's an issue that people have talked about. And so I think one thing that's been come up a few times is this idea of like decentralized moderation or decentralized moderation policies, where different groups can choose different moderation policies that they want to adhere to. And though I really like the sort of sovereignty of that approach, I also worry that that will contribute to the polarization that we're already seeing in the world right now. Like, I'm an American, there's like so much polarization. It sometimes seems like people are just living in like different worlds. Even if you look at something like the way people are talking about and reacting to the coronavirus, people are just not seeing the same information. They're processing it in totally different ways. And I do worry that like decentralized moderation policies could make that dynamic even more dangerous. So I don't know. I think there's some things that are really promising about it, but there's always going to be caveats, and there's always going to be things that you have to look out for and be careful about.
It's my favorite philosophic issue, because I'm personally sure that the code is just reflection of our way of thinking and how we try to build our society. And in social terms, actually, we're still the same people as we were behind 100 or 200 years ago. Yeah, we're still in technical progress is much, much faster than our social progress nowadays. So it's my favorite question to discuss. Can we overcome our social limits with code and with the way we will construct our engineering system and how it will affect to our social behavior as well?
Yeah, we could probably spend another hour on that.
No, we will let you go. Don't worry. We will let you go. You're a great person to talk to. What can we say? You have a lot of thoughts and we love hearing them. Could you name some projects, this is like our traditional question, that currently excite you, but we're going to ask you with a twist. Not just that currently excite you, but that in your opinion are at the advanced level of the technological implementations that they're doing. And you cannot say Cosmos and IBC. That's too boring. You have to go other ways.
I think that the most advanced technologies are not necessarily the things that are going to be the most impactful right now. So I think that there's a ton of really interesting cutting edge research happening across the space, ranging from cryptography stuff, whether that's zero knowledge stuff or something else, to even a lot of the DeFi economic experiments that are happening, I think are very cutting edge. But I don't know that those are the things that are going to actually make blockchains real, which I realize is a little bit of a cheeky way of saying it. The thing that I've been waiting for this whole time in the space, is the moment where blockchains will kind of make the jump from blockchain nerds to people who maybe don't care that much about the implementation details or the technologies, but are actually having their lives improved in some way by blockchain technology. And I don't really think that's happened yet. I think we are closer than ever. And if I didn't think we weren't going to be there eventually, I wouldn't be in the space. So I think I'm confident will happen. The thing that I'm starting to be excited about, and I won't name specific projects, but this is a trend that I'm starting to see that I think is very promising, are these tokens that are targeted towards very small groups of people. So sometimes these are what's called social tokens, a thing that someone has minted for you to invest in themselves or their art or their personal project. I think there's also community tokens that are targeted at a very, very small group of users or people. One project that is an example of this, although I do like them, but I don't want to say that they're the best or anything like that. It's just an example of this trend, is a project called the Region Network, which is built on Cosmos. So maybe that disqualifies them anyway. Their target audience is farmers who are farming in a regenerative way and farming in these ecological practices. And then they can use these tokens to incentivize people and reward people for following these practices. And people who want to invest in this system can invest in it through their tokens. And they actually have a very sophisticated top to bottom stack that verifies all this stuff and all these things. But that's an example of something where the user group is not that large in a lot of ways. It's probably bigger than I'm giving them credit for. Actually, most tokens that we've seen so far are targeted at very, very broad groups of people. Every human on the planet should be holding ETH or whatever. And ETH is amazing, but I think ETH is amazing as a conduit for a lot of these other projects and tokens that will be targeted at really small groups of people. And I think those really targeted micro tokens, I could even see it being for a group of friends or a household of people who have to split utilities and split groceries. I could see these really, really small tokens being the way that blockchains actually finally get their fingers in the rest of the world. So that's the trend that I'm starting to see, and that's the trend that I'm most excited about right now. But for the whole, I don't really want to name any specific names.
That's a really cool answer, actually. This is the most original answer we had, definitely, for sure.
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
Cool. Tess, it's been huge pleasure finally talking to you, and hopefully we'll catch you again sometimes in the future.
This has been super fun. Super, super fun conversation. Great questions. Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and bye.